I thought inheriting my aunt's estate would be the key to a better life, but as the walls of my home buckled under a violent intrusion, I realized I hadn't inherited a home. I had inherited a lethal, organized scheme. Now, caught between a husband who sold me out and a mother I thought was dead, I have to decide if I'll be the one to pay the ultimate price or the one who controls the board. The heavy mahogany door of the law firm clicked shut behind me, sealing in the scent of old paper and expensive cologne. I walked out into the crisp, biting air of the city, my heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement, but I barely felt the ground beneath me. I was floating. In my hand, I clutched a thick, cream-colored envelope, the key to a life I had only ever dreamed of. My aunt, a woman I hadn't seen in years, a woman who lived in a world of silence and solitude, was gone. She'd been a ghost in our family tree, a bitter, reclusive figure who avoided everyone, and yet she had remembered me. I checked my reflection in a shop window. I looked the same, tired, worn out by years of scrubbing floors and putting up with my husband Mark's constant disparaging remarks about my lack of ambition. But today, I felt transformed. I was no longer just the woman living in a cramped, moldy rental apartment. I was the owner of a sprawling, historic property in the most exclusive part of the city. The apartment was a palace, a legacy that meant I could finally leave, finally breathe, and finally be someone else. I couldn't wait to see the look on Mark's face. He was always complaining that I brought nothing to the table, that I was a burden, a dead weight, in his grand life plan. Well, the table had just turned. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Mark. "Where are you? Dinner is cold and the house is a wreck. Don't tell me you're out spending money we don't have again." A cold smirk touched my lips. I didn't reply. I wanted this to be a performance. I wanted to watch his ego shatter in real time. I imagined the scene. I'd walk in, drop the legal documents on the coffee table, and watch his arrogance evaporate. For years he had held the leash, reminding me that the rent was in his name, that the electricity was in his name, that my very existence was a concession he granted me. Tonight, for the first time in a decade, I held the cards. As I pulled into our driveway, the lights in the house were dim. I walked through the front door, the silence of the house feeling heavy, almost oppressive. I could hear him pacing in the living room. I smoothed my hair, took a deep breath, and walked in. Mark was standing by the window, his back to me, his shoulders tense. "You're late," he snapped, not turning around. "And I hope you have a damn good reason for not answering your phone. Do you have any idea how much pressure I'm under? The firm is conducting an internal audit, and the last thing I need is a domestic headache." "I think you'll want to sit down for this, Mark," I said, my voice steady, vibrating with a secret power. He finally turned, his eyes narrowing. He looked at me with that signature blend of condescension and boredom. "What? Are you going to tell me you're quitting that pathetic job of yours? Finally realized you aren't cut out for it?" I walked over to the coffee table and laid the envelope down, smoothing out the seal. "I'm not quitting my job, Mark. I'm quitting this." He let out a sharp, mocking laugh, but he walked toward the table, reaching for the envelope. "What is this? Another one of your desperate attempts to feel important?" He tore it open, his movement swift and aggressive. As he pulled out the document, his eyes darted across the pages. I watched his face closely. At first, it was dismissive. Then, confusion set in. Finally, his brow furrowed, and the color drained from his skin as he reached the section detailing the property transfer. He stopped, his grip tightening until his knuckles turned white. He looked up at me, his mouth agape, the condescension replaced by a sudden, jagged desperation. "This is a mistake," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Your aunt. She was involved in something, wasn't she? She was part of that organized scheme they dismantled last year. They cleared out everything. How is this even in your name?" I blinked, confused. My aunt? A criminal connection? She was a librarian, Mark. What are you talking about? He didn't answer. He dropped the papers as if they were burning his hands and scrambled toward the closet. He reached behind the shelving, pulling out a heavy, locked briefcase I had never seen before. He punched in a code, his fingers shaking, and the lid sprang open. My breath caught in my throat. Inside, there were no legal documents. There were thick bundles of cash, multiple passports with faces that looked vaguely like mine, and a folded piece of paper with a handwritten note. "She wasn't just a librarian, you idiot," he hissed, sweat beading on his forehead. "She was the one holding the inventory for the whole network. If you inherited that apartment, you didn't just inherit the keys, you inherited the stash." Just then, the front door rattled. A loud, heavy thud echoed through the house, followed by the sound of the deadbolt being forced. Mark's eyes went wide with genuine terror, and he looked at me, not with the malice I was used to, but with the hollow, defeated look of a man who knew he was already a ghost. "They aren't here for the apartment," he whispered, backing away. "They're here to make sure no one finds out what's actually hidden in the walls." The air in the living room grew thick, stagnant with the sudden metallic scent of fear. Outside, the rain began to lash against the siding, but it couldn't drown out the sound of heavy boots hitting the porch. Mark was trembling now, his facade of the arrogant husband completely obliterated. He shoved the briefcase toward me, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it. "Hide it," he hissed, his voice barely a tremor. "Go through the back door, take the alley, go to the garage. Just get out of sight." "Mark, what is going on?" I screamed, the scream catching in my throat. My mind was reeling. My quiet, bookish aunt, a woman who smelled of lavender and paper, was somehow connected to this. The weight of the briefcase felt like lead in my hands. I looked at the legal documents I had laid on the table only moments before, the ones that promised me a new life, and now they looked like a death warrant. "I told you, she was a keeper of the archives," Mark said, his eyes darting to the door as the frame began to splinter. "She managed the logistics for a large-scale organized scheme. I thought it was just a rumor, a cautionary tale told at the firm. She didn't just pass down an apartment, she passed down the leverage. If that briefcase is found, they won't just come for the money. They'll implicate anyone even remotely associated with her. They'll build a case around us that mirrors a charge of attempt to break a life with a serious criminal prosecution. We're already in the crosshairs." Another thunderous kick against the door sent a spider web of cracks shooting through the wood. I realized with a jolt of horror that Mark wasn't worried about my aunt's past. He was worried about his connection to it. "You knew," I said, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "You knew she was connected, and you were waiting for her to die. You wanted the inheritance to pay off your own debts, didn't you?" Mark didn't look at me. He was frantically pushing the furniture against the door, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. "That doesn't matter right now. If they find those files, the internal audit at my firm won't just be an investigation. It'll be a total annihilation. They'll bury us under an enormous sentence." "Give me the bag!" He lunged for the briefcase, but I instinctively recoiled. I looked toward the kitchen, toward the darkness of the backyard. I could hear voices outside, rough, low, and terrifyingly calm. They weren't rushing. They were methodical, like professionals finishing a job. "Open the door, Mark," one of the voices commanded from the porch. The voice was cold, devoid of humanity. "We know the legacy has been claimed. We just want the inventory." I looked at the back exit, then back at the living room. There was a secret panel behind the bookshelf, a feature I had always thought was just a quirky architectural detail of our old house, that my aunt had mentioned in a letter I had discarded years ago as nonsense. I ran toward it, my fingers fumbling to find the hidden spring. Mark saw what I was doing and panicked. "Don't touch that. If you trigger the alarm, it sends a signal directly to the Internal Security Service. They'll be here in minutes, and then we're really finished." I didn't listen. I slammed my palm against the wood, and with a sickening mechanical groan, the shelf swung inward, revealing a small, dark crawlspace that smelled of dust and something sharp, like cleaning chemicals, or worse, forbidden substances. "They're inside," Mark whispered, his face turning a ghostly shade of gray. I turned back to see the front door finally yield. It didn't just break, it buckled inward, and two figures in dark, nondescript tactical gear stepped into the foyer. They weren't carrying illegal weapons, but the way they moved, the calculated, predatory way they surveyed the room, was more terrifying than any blade. The taller one looked directly at me. His eyes were cold, scanning the room until they landed on the open briefcase in my hands. "The inventory," he said, his voice flat. "Hand it over, and we can discuss your survival. Keep it, and your fate will be tied to the files inside." Mark let out a sob, sinking to his knees. "She has it. Just take it from her. I had nothing to do with it." The man took a slow, deliberate step toward me. I backed into the dark crawl space, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The man raised a hand, and the lights in the entire house flickered and died, plunging us into total darkness. In the sudden silence of the blackout, I heard a metallic click, a device being activated, and then a low, buzzing sound began to emanate from the walls themselves, vibrating through my very bones. "The house is locked down," the man said from the darkness, his voice echoing from every direction at once. "There is no way out now. The real question is, which one of you is the true target?" I gripped the briefcase to my chest and backed further into the wall, my hand finding a cold, hard lever hidden in the shadows of the hidden room. I didn't know what it did, but as the footsteps grew closer, I realized I had only one choice. I pulled the lever. The floor beneath me didn't just shift. It gave way entirely, dropping me into an abyss I didn't know existed. As I fell, the last thing I saw was a flash of light in the living room, followed by the sound of glass shattering and the unmistakable, chilling voice of the man from the door. "We found the override. Now let's see what she's been hiding for all these years." The fall was short, ending in a jarring thud against a concrete floor that smelled of damp earth and stale air. Before I could even scream, I was swallowed by a darkness so absolute it felt like being buried alive. I huddled on the cold ground, clutching the briefcase against my chest as if it were a shield, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Above me, the hatch I had fallen through remained open, a sliver of faint, moonlight-infused air cutting through the blackness. I waited for the sound of them following me, for the heavy boots or the glint of a flashlight, but there was only the hum of electricity, a constant rhythmic vibration that seemed to pulse through the very foundations of the building. It occurred to me then that this wasn't just a crawl space, it was a bunker, a vault designed for someone who knew they were being hunted. My aunt hadn't been a librarian, she had been a librarian of secrets. I reached into my pocket, my fingers trembling until they found my phone. The screen flickered to life, the light blindingly bright in the pitch. I held it up, the beam cutting across a room filled with rows of metal filing cabinets, and to my horror, stacks of wrapped, dense bricks that bore the distinct markings of prohibited substances. This was the inventory. My aunt hadn't just been involved, she had been the primary custodian for a massive city-wide distribution network. Suddenly, a voice crackled through a hidden speaker somewhere in the room. It wasn't the intruder, it was my husband, Mark. His voice sounded thin, distorted by an intercom system. "Don't move, Sarah, please. If you touch those files, the Internal Security Service isn't just going to look for the network, they're going to look for everyone who knew about it. And that includes me. Do you hear me? You have to destroy it all. Use the incinerator in the corner. If you burn it, we can walk away." I scrambled to my feet, the light of my phone dancing over the room. There, in the corner, was a heavy steel incinerator, its control panel glowing a faint, ominous red. But why was Mark so desperate to destroy it? Was he trying to protect me, or was he trying to wipe the slate clean of his own involvement? "Why are you helping me, Mark?" I shouted into the void, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Because I love you, Sarah," he shouted back, though his voice lacked any shred of conviction. "I'm trying to save our lives. We have seconds before they reach the basement level. If they find you with those files, it's not just a prison term. It's a total disappearance. They'll paint you as the ringleader of the whole organized scheme. You'll be the face of the investigation for the next generation. They'll ensure you get a massive sentence, an endless, miserable existence behind bars." I moved toward the incinerator, the briefcase heavy in my hand. I opened it and the contents spilled out onto the concrete. It wasn't just money. There were journals, ledgers, and photos of me taken over the last 5 years without my knowledge. My heart stopped. These weren't photos of a random woman. They were surveillance logs. My aunt hadn't just left me an apartment. She'd been monitoring me for a decade, documenting every move I made, likely under the direction of someone else. Then I saw the final document in the pile. It was a notarized letter signed by my own mother, who had supposedly died when I was a child. The date on the letter was from 3 months ago. I fell to my knees, the weight of the revelation crushing me. My mother wasn't dead. She was the one who had coordinated the handoff. I wasn't just an heir, I was a pawn in a game that had been running since I was born. A heavy thud sounded above. Someone had breached the vault hatch. A flashlight beam swung down, sweeping the room. I dove behind a stack of crates, holding my breath. "I know you're down there," a voice called out, not the intruder's, but a new voice, feminine and eerily familiar. It was a voice I had heard only in childhood lullabies, a voice that had been silenced by a tragedy I had wept over for 20 years. "Come out, Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with a terrifying, calculated warmth. "The inventory isn't for destruction. It's for the transition of power. And your husband? He's already decided his role in this. He's going to take the fall. And you're going to take my place." As she stepped into the light of the basement, I saw her face clearly. It was my mother, looking exactly as she had the day she disappeared, her eyes cold, calculating, and completely void of love. She raised a small, compact device, not a weapon, but a tracker. "You were never just a niece, Sarah. You were the backup, and the Internal Security Service is already in the driveway waiting for the signal to finalize their internal audit. Now, choose. Does your husband go down for the organized scheme, or do you?" She walked toward me, the sound of her heels clicking on the concrete like a countdown to my destruction. I clutched the ledger to my chest, realizing that I was completely trapped between a man who had used me and a mother who had groomed me. I glanced at the incinerator one last time, my hand hovering over the emergency release button that, according to the manual on the wall, would vent the room and everything inside into the city's main sewer line, effectively burying the evidence forever. I looked up at her, my teeth clenched and my finger poised over the button. "You aren't my mother," I whispered. "No," she replied, smiling. "I'm your employer." She lunged, and at the exact same moment the floor beneath her feet began to glow a violent electric blue, accompanied by the high-pitched whine of a security system arming itself to purge the facility. The siren started, a deafening, piercing wail that signaled that the Internal Security Service had just bypassed the primary lock. The hatch above was ripped away, and I saw the silhouette of someone aiming a long-range weapon directly into the vault. My mother didn't even look up. She just grabbed my arm with a grip like iron and hissed, "Press that button, Sarah, or we both die right now." The siren was a physical blow, a screeching, dissonant wail that seemed to vibrate in the marrow of my bones. My mother, the woman who had been a ghost in my childhood memories, a tragic loss I had mourned for 2 decades, was now a cold, metallic presence, her fingers digging into my arm with the force of a vice. Her eyes, which I had once imagined in framed photographs on my bedside table, were now flat, devoid of any maternal warmth, reflecting only the harsh, pulsating blue light of the vault's emergency alarm. "Press the button, Sarah," she hissed again, the demand devoid of any motherly affection. "Do you think you're the only one who has been living a lie? Your entire life has been a carefully constructed buffer. The apartment, the job, the marriage to Mark, every bit of it was designed to place you exactly where you needed to be the day the Internal Security Service decided to purge the archives. If that incinerator doesn't wipe this data now, you aren't just going to jail. You're going to be erased." I looked at the console, my vision blurred by the sheer, suffocating scale of the betrayal. I thought of Mark, the pathetic, trembling man who had been willing to sell me out in a heartbeat just to save his own skin. And I realized then that he wasn't just a husband, he was a monitor. He was the one who had been reporting to her for years, ensuring I never looked too closely at my aunt's legacy. "You used him," I choked out, my voice sounding like sandpaper. "You used my marriage to keep me under surveillance." "Marriage is just a legal contract, dear, and yours was particularly useful," she replied, her gaze flicking toward the open hatch above. The sound of heavy, synchronized footsteps pounded on the floorboards of the kitchen upstairs. They were descending. The Internal Security Service, the phantom agency my husband had lived in terror of, had arrived to finalize the audit. "They're coming for the ledger," she whispered, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. "If they find it, they'll have evidence of every transaction, every name, every life ruined by this network. They'll bury you under an enormous, decades-long sentence to make an example of you. But if you hit that release button, the evidence vanishes into the city's industrial disposal system, and we walk out of here through the subtunnel while they search for ghosts." "And what happens to Mark?" I asked, my thumb hovering just millimeters from the scorched metal of the release. She let out a dry, chilling laugh. "Mark? Mark is the sacrificial lamb. He was always intended to be the fall guy for the organized scheme. He knew the risks when he signed the papers. He's the reason you're alive to stand here right now, because he was the one who kept the authorities focused on his own petty, failing career while we handled the real business." The footsteps above stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the siren. Then a voice boomed from the foyer, a deep, amplified command that shook the dust from the ceiling. "This is the Internal Security Service. Secure the premises. No one leaves. Any movement in the basement will be met with lethal measures." My mother's face twisted into a mask of pure, predatory focus. She grabbed my wrist and forced my hand down toward the console. "Now, Sarah. Do it now." I looked at her, and for a fleeting, sickening second, I saw my own reflection in her eyes. I didn't see a victim. I saw someone who had been forged in the dark, someone who was capable of doing whatever was necessary to survive. I realized that if I pressed that button, I wasn't just destroying the evidence of her crimes, I was becoming a part of them. I would be an accomplice in the eyes of the law, a collaborator in a shadow world I had only just discovered. But if I didn't, I would be standing in this vault when the doors burst open, clutching a briefcase that effectively signed my life away. "I'm not doing it for you," I whispered, my voice hardening. "Do it for yourself, then," she barked, just as the first canister of blinding white gas hissed into the vault from the vents above. Panic set in. The air turned opaque, thick and choking. I couldn't see my mother, only the blue, pulsating light of the console, the red glow of the button, and the dark silhouette of the figure now leaping down through the hatch, weapon drawn, moving with the terrifying efficiency of a professional ghost. I felt a sharp, stinging sensation in my shoulder, a tranquilizer dart maybe, or something worse, and my knees began to buckle. "Sarah!" the voice from above shouted, but it was distant, muffled by the rising drone of the ventilation system. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and slammed my palm against the emergency release. The room shrieked as the massive steel floor panels began to slide open, revealing a dark, churning abyss of industrial machinery below. The briefcase, the ledger, the photos of my childhood, everything began to slide toward the edge, pulled by the sudden, violent vacuum of the suction system. My mother grabbed for the ledger, her mask of composure shattering into a raw, desperate scream. She lunged, and as she did, she tripped over the shifting steel, her hand slipping from my arm. As she fell toward the maw of the incinerator, she reached out, grabbing my jacket, pulling me with her. We were both sliding, the screech of metal on metal deafening, the darkness beneath us yawning wide like the throat of a beast. As the floor plates fully retracted, I felt the sickening lurch of free fall. I saw the shadow of the security agent above, reaching down in a futile gesture, his face a blur of shock. Then everything went black, not just from the gas, but from the sudden, violent impact of something hitting my head. As I drifted into the void, I heard one final chilling sound, the metallic clack-clack of a weapon being readied, and a voice I didn't recognize whispering into a radio. "The asset is secured. The primary target has been purged. Proceed to clean up." I woke up, but I wasn't in a vault, and I wasn't in a basement. The silence was absolute. I was strapped to a chair in a room made of glass, overlooking the city skyline from such a height that the lights looked like stars in a dead universe. Across from me sat a man in an immaculate gray suit, holding the exact same briefcase I had supposedly sent to the incinerator. He tapped the leather, a slow, rhythmic sound that echoed in the sterile room. "You've been asleep for a long time, Sarah," he said, his voice as smooth as velvet, "and you have a lot of explaining to do. Not about the organized scheme, but about why you were the only person in that vault who didn't have a file." The glass walls of the room hummed with a low-frequency vibration that seemed to match the thrum of my own heartbeat. I tried to move my hands, but the cuffs were cold against my wrists, biting deep into my skin. The man in the gray suit didn't look like an interrogator. He looked like an architect of realities. He leaned back, the briefcase sitting between us like a dormant predator. "You're wondering why you're here instead of a holding cell," he said, his voice barely rising above the hum of the ventilation. "You're wondering why your mother, the woman you thought was a ghost, is currently being held in a facility that doesn't exist on any map. And most of all, you're wondering why your file is empty." He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was my birth certificate. The ink looked freshly printed, the seal shimmering with a holographic sheen. I looked at it and my breath hitched. There were no parents listed. In the place of my name, there was a series of alphanumeric codes. "You were never an heir, Sarah," he continued, his eyes devoid of malice but filled with a terrifying clinical detachment. "You were a containment measure. Your aunt was not a librarian, and your mother was not a fugitive. They were both part of a long-term oversight project initiated by the service to manage the internal integrity of our city's logistics. We needed someone to hold the keys to the organized network, someone who wouldn't know they were holding them until the moment of crisis. You were the fail-safe." I felt a wave of nausea. A fail-safe? I had a life. I had a husband who— "Mark was an operative, just like the rest of them," he interrupted, his tone dismissive. "He was tasked with ensuring you never became aware of your role until the network reached its breaking point. When the vault was purged, when you hit that button, you didn't just destroy evidence. You performed the final step of the protocol. You erased the liability." He stood up and walked to the window, gesturing to the city below, a sprawling grid of lights that suddenly looked like a circuit board. "The ledger you incinerated contained nothing of value. It was a bait file, a digital trap set to lure the radical factions into the open. By destroying it, you proved you were capable of detachment. You didn't save yourself, Sarah. You completed your training." I looked at him, my mind racing through the fragments of the last 24 hours. The briefcase, the vault, the betrayal, the fall. It was all a simulation of trauma designed to calibrate me. So what now? Do I go back to my life? To my apartment? He turned back to me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something human, a tired, heavy acknowledgement. The apartment is gone. The house is a crime scene. Mark is currently facing an enormous sentence for his supposed role in the scheme, a necessary sacrifice to keep the public narrative intact. As for you, you cannot go back. You are now the primary administrator of the network your mother managed. You hold the keys to the city's logistics, the flow of goods, the internal balance. You are the invisible hand. He tapped the briefcase. The question is, will you be a better guardian than your mother? I looked at the briefcase, then at my own hands. I thought of the years I had spent feeling small, unimportant, and trapped. I thought of the power that had been hidden in the walls of my own home, and the way the world had shifted the moment I realized it was mine to command. The fear hadn't vanished. It had simply evolved into something sharper, something more controlled. If I accept this, I said, my voice steady, do I get to choose who stays in the dark? He offered a thin, cryptic smile. The network requires an administrator, not a crusader. But the structure is yours to mold, provided the equilibrium is maintained. He pressed a button on the table, and the cuffs around my wrists clicked open. He pushed the briefcase toward me. It felt lighter now, no longer a weight, but a tool. I stood up, my legs steady, and looked out at the city. It wasn't just a skyline anymore. It was a map of my own reach. I took the briefcase. I didn't feel like the victim I had been yesterday, and I didn't feel like the pawn I had been raised to be. I felt like the architect. As I walked toward the heavy steel door at the back of the room, I caught my reflection in the glass one last time. I didn't see the woman who had cried in the kitchen while her husband berated her. I saw a face that was cold, capable, and ready. I pushed the door open, leaving the room behind. I didn't look back at the man in the gray suit. I walked out into the corridor, my footsteps echoing with a finality that signaled the end of the old world and the beginning of mine. I was done with the life of a pawn. The apartment, the secret, the leverage, it was all mine now. And as I stepped into the elevator, destined for the heart of the network, I knew one thing for certain. I would never let anyone break me again. I was no longer the one being watched. I was the one who would be doing the watching.